I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, we have the OPCW final report on the Duma chemical weapons attack. Just to remind everybody, that was the attack on Duma, which is situated a little outside of Damascus, which prompted the United States, France, and I believe the UK to launch missile strikes.
Absolutely.
Onto the airfields, the Syrian airfields?
That's right. That's right. And a Syrian center where they said that these chemical weapons had been
exactly, and that was in. Correct me with the time frame. Was that April of 2018? I believe that false flag. It was somewhere around there. If my time frame is wrong, guys, in the comments down below, I'm sure you'll be able to correct me as always. Yes, April 14th, 2018 was when the U.S. Launched those strikes. The U.S., UK, and France after that chemical weapons attack. False flag as to what I'm reading from the OPCW report, Alexander. So I won't even say attack now. I'll say false flag. The inspectors are done. Alexander, you read the report. You analyzed it. What does it say? What does it prove? What does it disprove?
Well, the first thing to say is it disproves conclusively the claim that was made at the time by several people, including US officials, that sarin was used in the attack. We can now say conclusively that didn't happen. There was no traces of sarin anywhere in Duma. The inspectors went all over Duma and they found nothing there. Now, what they are saying is they found traces of compounds which might have pointed to chlorine. Now, the point to understand about chlorine is that chlorine is not a prohibited substance. It is not usually used as a chemical weapon. It is widely used in lots of domestic and industrial applications, and it is not completely surprising if chlorine is found in a particular location. And in fact, if you drill very carefully through the report, they say in a slightly elliptical way that though these traces of chlorine were found, they do not actually prove in and of and by themselves that chlorine was actually used in any chemical weapon attack on Duma. But they go on to say, largely on the strength of witnesses, and of course we have to wonder who these witnesses are, and on the strength of videos, which are of course the videos which were uploaded at the time, and which the white helmets have played a huge role in creating, that the witnesses do suggest that there was some sort of attack using chlorine, and they link that claim of an attack to these findings of chlorine traces. Now, I am very skeptical about these witness statements. I don't really place much credence on them. And as I said, the forensic evidence, the actual scientific evidence, is actually inconclusive. So what the report is doing is it's putting together unreliable witness evidence from people who have an interest in claiming that there was a chemical attack, and they're putting that together with scientific or forensic evidence, which is inconclusive. And they're putting these two things together, and they're trying to claim on that basis that there is evidence of a chemical attack, but they can't say definitely that there was, and they don't say who carried it out.
All right, let me read you some excerpts from the report, Alexander. You can comment on that. And one of the excerpts actually deals with the fact that some witnesses, though you did state some witnesses said that some people were suffering from chlorine inhalation. There were some witnesses who seemed to also corroborate the fact that many reporters stated that a lot of people suffered from smoke inhalation and then shelling dust inhalation. And there were some witnesses that also stated that as well. Let me read you an excerpt from the report. And I quote, "Some witnesses stated that many people died in the hospital on the 7th of April as a result of the heavy shelling and/or suffocation due to inhalation of smoke and dust. As many as 50 bodies were lying on the floor of the emergency department awaiting burial. Others stated that there were no fatalities in the Duma hospital on the 7th of April and that no bodies were brought to the hospital that day. So we're not looking at chlorine. We're definitely not looking at sarin. We're not looking at chlorine, but some witnesses are saying people died because of smoke inhalation and dust, which could be common in any type of bombing or conflict area. But there are other witnesses that say there were no fatalities. What do you make of that excerpt?
Well, we come back to what I said, the witness evidence that the OPCW is trying to use to claim that there was a chlorine attack is either very unreliable or contradictory. And here we have two contradictions. Some people say, well, it wasn't a chemical attack. It was all the dust and smoke. And in a major battle with lots of shelling and lots of bombing, one would expect there to be lots of dust and smoke. Others say, well, actually, there weren't any real fatalities at all, and the whole thing was made up. So we have different accounts given by different witnesses. If you have ever dealt with witnesses, you will know that is actually very common. But what the OPCW has done is it's taken certain witnesses and chosen to believe them in preference to others. That is not the way you are supposed to use witness evidence. Personally, I think some people did die in Duma from smoke and suffocation. It would be very surprising if they didn't, but I don't really see that the evidence of a chlorine attack here is at all strong.
And what about the OPCW finding the canister? This was an interesting part of the report. Yeah. I don't know if you dug into that as well, Alexander, where the OPCW found a canister which was similar to the canisters that they say were dropped on the locations of the attack. They found it in one of the jihadist terrorist warehouses. The Western mainstream media is reporting that it was some sort of setup by the Syrian army. The Huffington Post in UK in particular is saying that. But there are other people who are claiming that that is proof that the jihadists were actually the ones that were creating these canisters with possible chlorine chemicals in them to use as a weapon. So what do you make of that claim in the report?
Well, there's two things first to say. Firstly, it's not clear that these two chlorine canisters that were found on the scene actually did carry chlorine in them. There's some evidence that they might have done, but it's not conclusive, and that's what the report says. But this third canister that turned up in a warehouse is extremely interesting because, of course, it seems to be the same or a very similar sort of canister to the other two which were used. And I'm well aware of the fact that some people are trying to explain this away by saying that this third canister was a plant. If it was a plant, the OPCW now have been given the means to investigate that. They don't seem to have used such means. There's no reason, therefore, to think it was a plant. They were very careful not to inspect this third canister properly. And, of course, the existence of this third canister actually undermines the chlorine attack by the Syrian military story.
All right, let me read you the article from Chris York from the Huffington Post, where he does mention this third canister, and he looks to explain it away as some sort of plant, some sort of setup. And here's the quote, Alexander. He's referring to the workshop now, and he says, "The rebel explosives lab that had been captured by the SSA days before, and which they were desperately trying to make look like a chemical weapons lab." So he's insinuating that the SSA captured this workshop and then they started to refurbish it to make it look like it was a jihadist workshop. What do you make of that claim from the Huffington Post?
It's a guess. He's just guessing. He doesn't know that. that is purely a guess. And now, can I just say, if you reel back in time to the events around Duma, there was, as I remember, bitter arguments on the Security Council at that time. The Russians were lobbying very, very strongly for the OPCW inspectors to come to Duma as soon as possible. The Western powers were dragging their feet, and so was the OPCW. It took several days for them to get there, and of course that happened after the area had been secured by the Russian military police. Now, for them to come around and say that, the Syrian military use these days to plant evidence, first of all, that is just a guess. I mean, we have no reason to believe that is so. But secondly, given that the Russians and the Syrians were actively pushing for the inspectors to come, that doesn't seem to me to sit very comfortably with the argument that they were at the same time planting evidence in this way. I don't really think that makes a great deal of sense to me.
And the OPCW does state that when they were looking at this warehouse, this workshop for chemical weapons, really was what it was, that it did not seem like it had been altered to suggest some sort of plant or some sort of conspiracy to frame these jihadists from the Syrian army.
No. As I said, I come back to this. This is a guess, it's not a claim that the OPCW are making. It's important to stress that. It is a claim which has been made by other people. Right. They're coming along and they're saying, well, this was a plant. There's no, as I said, evidence that was a plant. It's only what they want it to be.
Right, correct. And now let's get to the cui bono factor of it all, which to me is, even though it's the hardest one to qualify and quantify, it's probably to me the one that makes the most sense, which is why would the Syrian army, as they were winning the war, decisively winning the war, why would they decide to launch a chemical attack so close to Damascus as well, in an area where they were, and you can get into it a little, Alexander, in an area that they were eventually going to take over, and they were going to beat the jihadists in Duma in either case. So why would they do that to their own people?
Well, indeed. I mean, always motive is a difficult issue in these kind of investigations. But in this case, it's very difficult to see any motive on the part of the Syrian military at all. Duma was about to fall. There'd been negotiations underway for these jihadi militants to leave the town. Those negotiations broke down. There was a Syrian military attack. And then almost immediately, the jihadis, faced with the Syrian army, decided to change their mind and agreed to leave. So it doesn't seem very likely that the Syrian military, which had absolutely the overwhelming upper hand, would need to use chemical weapons in this way. That doesn't make a great deal of sense. The only likely effect of doing so would have been to attract a military response from the United States. And why would they do that? I'm going to add something else, which is that, of course, chlorine, as military people have told me, is not actually a particularly good chemical weapon anyway. It was used briefly by the Germans during the First World War as a chemical weapon. It wasn't found to be very effective, and that was why it wasn't used. So why would the Syrian military undertake the huge risks of using chemical weapons in an attack like this and do so with such an inefficient weapon? It's very difficult to make that really make sense or to make it add up.
So the case is now closed for Duma, is that correct?
Absolutely. Now, I think, can I make one final point? I mean, this is another point about the OPCW, which I think we need to understand, which is that over the last few months, and especially it's become very clear since the Skripal affair, it's quite clear that the Western powers have placed heavy pressure on the OPCW for it to actually find decisions which the Western powers favour. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That is, in fact, I think, a valid view. because, of course, they've also given the OPCW, against Russian and Chinese opposition, the power to investigate chemical weapons attacks. Now, in an attack, in a situation where the United States and Britain and France have said that a chemical attack happened, and where they themselves launched a military attack on Syria, which damaged property and damaged Syrian facilities, it would be extremely difficult to expect an organization like the OPCW to come round and say that there was no chemical weapons attack at all, because doing so would put the United States, Britain and France in a very, very difficult position legally. So we must assume that there has been massive pressure behind the scenes for the OPCW to come up with a report which would put the blame back on the Syrian government and would acquit the Western powers, the United States, Britain and France, of a military act which would otherwise be conclusively illegal.
Right, exactly. So the OPCW is just basically saying that, yes, it was a false flag. In so many words, are saying we know that it was a bullshit chemical attack, but we're going to provide a very nice off-ramp to the United States, the UK, and France, and we won't say that, they illegally attacked Syria based on a false flag, bullshit chemical weapons.
Off-ramp is exactly what it is. Yeah. They're providing the United States, Britain and France with a degree of cover for that missile attack, which was carried out in the immediate days after the Duma affair. Now, that missile attack actually changed nothing, but it was an illegal attack on Syria by those three countries. Given that it was illegal, they can't really, we can't really expect them now to come along and say, well, actually, the whole justification for it was bogus all along.
And can I make one final statement, Alexander? You could tell me if this is a correct statement. We should not forget that it was a false flag chemical weapons hoax propagated by Al-Qaeda, ISIS jihadists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS jihadists, for which the United States, the UK, and France decided to believe and to back up and to attack the legitimate, internationally recognized government in Syria. Is that a correct statement?
Right. Well, I think that the group, the jihadi militant group that was in control of Duma, were not actually either ISIS or Al Qaeda, but they were pretty close. I mean, ideologically, there's not.
Well, the white helmets were not the white helmets right there.
They were certainly involved in propagating this story. Yeah. To what extent they were actually there is debatable, but that's another issue again. But the point is, we need to be very careful because, of course, Al-Qaeda exists as an organization, and it's also a franchise, and you have various groups which at various times join the franchise and then opt out of it. The key point is that the people in charge of Duma were a militant jihadi group who, if they were operating anywhere else in the world, the United States, Britain and France would have no hesitation in calling a terrorist organization. So given that is so, and given the history of the Syrian war, assuming that people like this would not stage an incident, would not concoct a provocation, it is a completely unwarranted assumption.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, then it's the United States, the UK, and France coming to the aid and backing up this jihadist group, a terrorist organization.
Well, indeed so. And may I say,
in the most simplistic form of kind of phrasing it.
Indeed so, and that's exactly right, and that's been the true, of course, of the Syrian war all along, because, I mean, the people who have been fighting the Syrian government overwhelmingly have been jihadi militant groups who we would call, all these Western governments would call terrorist organizations if they were operating anywhere else. And the things that they have done in Syria within Syria to the civilian populations there have amounted to terrorism.
Yeah, but they brand them as moderate rebels, and that's what they were branding them for 6-7 years throughout the war.
Well, indeed so. And I mean, this has been one of the absurdities and frankly demonstrable untruths of the Syrian war.
Yeah, clever marketing, clever packaging, clever branding.
Yeah. Well, and an attempt to, as I said, ignore the realities, even though these have been pointed out time and time again.
And I think that's the most embarrassing part, or kind of dragging it out a little, but I think that's the most important part and the most embarrassing part is that the Trump administration, for everything that Trump said, for all its rhetoric, get out of Syria, we're gonna kick ISIS, we're gonna destroy ISIS, we're gonna bomb ISIS to hell. For all of that rhetoric that the Trump campaign said before the election and after he won, he did launch a military strike onto Syria in defense of these jihadist terrorists. And that was the off-ramp that the OPCW had to provide for him.
Indeed so. And can I just add, he's launched 2 attacks on Syria, one in April 2018, one in April 2017. The April 2017 attack followed an alleged chemical attack, which I also personally believe was a provocation, in a town called Khan Shaykhun. And the people who were in charge in al-Shaykhun absolutely were Al-Qaeda. The ones in Duma might have been a breakaway group from Al-Qaeda, those sharing the same ideology. But in Khan Shaykhun, it was Al-Qaeda and no one else.
Very well put, Alexander Mercouris. And I just want to note to our viewers that there's an excellent article from 21st Century Wire from Tony Cartolucci. I will put that article, a link to that article in the description box as well, so you can take a look at what the OPCW did find and did report on in Duma as well. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on that notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Visit the Duran shop, buy a t-shirt, help support the Duran, and in the description box down below, you will find links to our PayPal and Patreon pages. Donate to the Duran. That really helps us out a lot. And you can get a copy of this video in audio format. Follow us on iTunes and Soundcloud. Go to theduran.com to see all the articles that Alexander Mercouris links up to every day. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you once again. Till next time, everybody. Take care.